Welcome, Shannon. We're so excited to have you on the way home. We're going to begin with our signature question. What does home mean to you?
Yeah, this is a good one. I was thinking about this. To me, I think home is feeling safe. I think it's a soft place to land where the ones I love can gather and feel accepted and warm. I don't think home has to be grand or elaborate, but it does have to provoke a feeling of security and a place to rest and recharge, which is really important. And I think most importantly, home means something that I can call my own in whatever shape or form that is, make it my own, and surround myself with everything and everyone that's important to me.
And you've spent over a decade working with individuals impacted by the justice system. I'm wondering if you can share with our listeners what first drew you to this work, what continues to drive your passion today, and maybe just tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you. So many years ago, when I was in college, I was really fortunate to do a college placement at the Central East Correctional Center in Lindsay, which is a maximum security correctional institution, a provincial one. And it was fairly new at the time back then. So it was there that I was first introduced to the nuances of the justice system. And I realized how some incarcerated individuals were really just victims of so many systems who have failed them. So the John Howard Society of Kawartha Lakes had an institutional services program when I was there, where staff actually go into the institution and support individuals with resources and programming. And so that's when I was first introduced to the work that JHS did. So I knew right away that being in that sort of environment was something that I wanted to do. And specifically with the John Howard Society, because it was so incredibly different from other services that I had encountered or learned about up until that point. So I think when most people think of social services, there's an automatic idea that it's helping vulnerable and marginalized populations. And that rings very true in the work that we do. But there is a whole other layer of complexities when you're working with individuals who are criminalized. So many people are supported by the John Howard Society. We have 18 offices across the province. And so many of those individuals have been denied the dignity and the respect that they deserve by other service providers simply because they haven't been involved with the legal system. There is a preconceived notion that comes with being labeled a criminal. And not only is it incredibly unfair, but those labels present some really extraordinary barriers to some very basic needs that I think a lot of us take for granted. So not only are these individuals trying to navigate through some really complex systems, but they're doing it with a flashing light on their heads that say criminal. And that can make it difficult for them to get really quality trauma-informed care, which is what they deserve just as much as anybody else. So anyway, with that journey, I eventually went into to get my degree in sociology, which was kind of the perfect field for me because I'm constantly asking why about the world around me. And that's still happening today. So over 13 years later in this agency, we are still trying to figure out the why behind criminality. People who work at all of the John Howards across the province, we know that we're helping to give our clients back their humanity and we're showing them the respect they deserve. And that's why I'll never stop being an advocate for our clients, because this work drives me and my team to change the narrative about the kind of respect that every single person deserves, regardless of their circumstances, which is kind of a long-winded answer. But that's kind of what drew me to this field specifically, and then to John Howard in particular.
But certainly an awesome answer also, Shannon. And for our listeners too, I do want to share that I feel it like it was last year. I know there's been partnerships between Blue Door and John Howard Society for as far back as we can remember, but specifically a very great innovative connection that we have is through the Construct program, where we're able to work with your team to help those facing barriers to kind of reintegrate into the job market, and the services that you provide in terms of helping them reintegrate and then connecting to employment opportunities as well. And
absolutely. One of the biggest barriers is employment. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So maybe tell us about, in your role with the John Howard Society of York Region, what are some of the most urgent challenges you're seeing right now at the intersection of justice and homelessness?
Yeah, so right now in our province specifically, too many people are stuck in a perpetual cycle between homelessness and incarceration. And this is a barrier that further inflates the homelessness crisis, but also compromises public safety and puts really significant strain on so many other systems and resources. 2023, 2024, Ontario had an estimated 80,000 people who were experiencing homelessness. Over 40,000 were released from provincial correctional institutions. And of those, almost 7,500 were recorded as being released without housing. And that represents almost 10% of Ontario's homeless population. They're not unique individuals. We recognize that some individuals enter the system and exit more than once in a lifetime or during the count. But it's important to note that this does exemplify how the legal system is a significant contributor to homelessness in the province. So the intersection of justice and homelessness really starts when we look at housing as more than just a shelter. It's a human right, it's a health necessity. You know that. But housing is also a really crucial element in building safe communities. We know that stable housing, when it relates to criminality, is proven to reduce recidivism rates, but it also improves health outcomes and lessens the financial burden on systems like emergency rooms. So without adequate and safe housing, unhoused individuals sometimes have no choice but to turn to illegitimate ways to get their most basic needs met, which is where that cycle comes in. John Howard Society of Ontario, which is our provincial office, published a report in 2024 that found that incarceration is a double-edged sword, that it is the leading cause of homelessness, but also a direct result of homelessness. So today versus 15 years ago, provincial institutions are incarcerating a larger number of people who report that they lack stable housing upon entry into jail, which means when they're released, they have nowhere to go. So this perpetual cycle needs to be highlighted in every space where homelessness and housing is being discussed, including at regional and provincial levels. I think we're doing a great job here at York Region in talking about it, but I think it needs to be talked about at all levels about this cycle.
Which is a perfect segue for the next question. When we talk about the report you mentioned, From Incarceration to Encampment, which highlights that over 7,400 people left Ontario jails last year with no fixed address, what does that statistic reveal about the current state of our systems?
Yeah, I think it shows that, like so many other systems in our province, the justice system, correctional institutions in particular, are stretched to capacity and they're systemically broken for the climate we live in right now. So people are facing more significant barriers today than they have in the past, and yet the justice system continuously fails to address the causes of crime and instead focuses on reactive instead of proactive responses. We know that jail is supposed to be a punishment. Nobody denies that. But punitive measures should not exist to push people who are in the justice system further into barriers. So when incarcerated individuals are released from institutions directly into homelessness, their chances of developing comorbidities such as decreased health indicators, decreased social outcomes, they rise significantly, as does their chances of reoffending. So incarceration is necessity in some cases, but it also should be a time for individuals to work on addressing barriers that have led them to criminality. But this doesn't often happen in institutions because they just don't have the capacity, which means they aren't supported inside. And then it's very rare that they're able to get the supports recommended to them before they are released. It is important to note the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous individuals within the justice system. Black and Indigenous populations face higher levels of policing, incarceration, and biased treatment. In Ontario, correction services admit Black people 3 times more than that of the general population, and Indigenous people 6 times more. So on top of facing the pre-existing systemic racism and colonialism, Black and Indigenous folks also have to deal with barriers related to over-incarceration. So all of these facts point to just a really broken system that is in need of some serious updates and change.
And so many people might not realize that some individuals are released without ever being convicted of a crime. I think you touched on that a minute ago. How does that reality complicate the issue, both socially and ethically?
Yeah, so speaking of provincial institutions specifically, I think it's really important to know that of the thousands of people housed in these buildings, about 80% of them are being held on remand, which means that they've been charged with a crime, but they have not actually yet been convicted of that crime. So they're waiting in jail on the very lengthy court process, but continuing to be detained in the meantime. So of significance to note is that of a very large number of people who were held on remand, they later had their charges dropped or withdrawn. So that's weeks or months of incarceration when there was no guilty charge, or sorry, no guilty conviction. And so while all of these individuals were sitting in pre-trial detention, they still experienced the punitive and long-lasting impacts of incarceration. So they're sitting on remand and they're losing their jobs or their income supports, their homes, or any other outside supports that they may have. So because remanded individuals also, they don't know how long they'll be locked up, oftentimes they're released on a date that wasn't known to them. And so there was no time to get some supports in place prior to being released. So they're again put into the community without proper supports or referrals or access to services like housing in their communities that they may have lost while they were inside.
When you referred to homes, are you talking about like prison? At the start, when you said like a number of people being in these homes?
All right. Yes.
Okay.
80% of individuals that are in provincial institutions are being held on remand.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, thank you.
Sorry.
And so, I mean, I'm just, thinking more about what you're saying, just that wait time too can, I guess right away probably makes you lose your employment if you
Mhm.
had and
And
other.
income supports as well. Yeah.
So the report does describe the justice system as a pipeline into homelessness. Can you walk us through how that cycle actually plays out for someone leaving incarceration?
Yeah. So John Howard Society of Ontario's report found that our province's justice system is releasing a large amount of individuals from jail straight onto the streets with absolutely no supports. And again, a lot of them not convicted of a crime. So not as only is the cycle unjust and inhumane, it's expensive and it's costing our province specifically unnecessary money, and it's completely preventable. So it's important to know incarceration and justice system impacts different populations and communities in really different ways, but the degree to which it can cause homelessness is pretty universal. It's really important to recognize some of the reasons for incarceration before then recognizing how it can lead to homelessness. So for example, women, a lot of women who are in institutions may have experienced intimate partner violence or violence due to homelessness as victims because they're incredibly vulnerable if they're unhoused. Which can lead to being involved in criminal activity. Single mothers make up 64% of incarcerated women. It's very common to see both partners, I will generalize and say a male and a female, charged in instances of domestic violence. And so when women are primary caregivers to their children, incarceration can have a significant impact on the entire family unit. So while they're incarcerated, they may have lost their homes, they may have lost their children, and they probably lost their source of income. So there's some more barriers when they're released. When we look at members of the 2S LGBTQIA plus communities, a lot of them, specifically young folks, face family rejection, discrimination, harassment. It can impact housing stability at a very, very young age, which again can increase their chances of exploitation, risk, violence, and criminalization. Victimization and exploitation can be reasons for justice system involvement. And then, of course, post-release, without these proper supports, they can continue post-release. And then there's that cycle again of continued recidivism, reoffending. And then, as I spoke about earlier, Black and Indigenous individuals face over-policing, racial profiling, barriers to housing and employment, on top of criminal justice involvement. So these disenfranchised populations are overrepresented overrepresented in the criminal legal system. And then this system of inequality and systemic discrimination continues to put up barriers to accessing housing. So while the populations I just spoke about experience homelessness and criminalities in really different ways, it's a universal belief that housing is an essential piece in breaking the cycle. Without a safe and adequate place to live, it is extremely difficult for anyone who has just been released to follow conditions, to access healthcare, to search for employment, and to build a sense of community, which is really important to make sure they don't reoffend. And so when someone is housed, the idea is that these outcomes improve.
That makes perfect sense. And so from your experience, what are the biggest barriers preventing people from successfully reintegrating into the community after being released and finding, well, we'll get into the housing piece specifically soon, but maybe reintegrating into the community. I know you've touched on it a bit, but is there more?
Yeah, and there's lots of amazing programs that exist to serve individuals who are leaving incarceration to successfully reintegrate back into their communities. So my agency has facilitated the York Region Reintegration Program for years, which supports individuals leaving institutions with things like intensive case management, basic needs, goal planning. Advocacy is a really important one, and then of course system navigation. But currently right now in our province, we don't have a housing program anywhere that is dedicated to transitional housing for those leaving incarceration, provincial incarceration. If you didn't have a house when you entered the system, you won't, or you've lost it when you're locked up, you won't have a house when you return to your community. So one of the ways, of course, to address this barrier is for the Ontario government to create a system of transitional housing specific to individuals exiting provincial institutions. We have something similar at the federal level, community-based residential facilities, CRFs, commonly known as halfway houses, is funded by Corrections Canada, so the federal government, but nothing yet exists in the provincial system. So hand in hand with a lack of housing, social assistance is interrupted when someone enters incarceration. This is not the case, for example, if I was on social assistance and I entered the hospital for a period of under 3 months, I would not lose my social assistance, my income supports during that time. But if I was the same person entering a provincial institution for under 3 months, I would immediately lose my supports. So when someone is incarcerated, income support is discontinued for any amount of jail time, and it is extremely difficult to get reinstated upon release. So even short stays in custody, like we talked about those remands, even short stays can significantly impact someone's income and by default, their housing. So this is one of those barriers that at the OW and the ODSP levels needs to be addressed. So income assistance is not cut off for those incarcerated for say less than 3 months as it is with the hospital stays. And then I think finally, one of the biggest barriers is that there is an incredible amount of stigma around having a criminal record, and the use of criminal record checks, the overuse of criminal record checks in the housing applications in the private market is preventing a lot of individuals from accessing the private rental housing market because they're flagged right away, regardless of what their crime is. A lot of people are fearful of what comes from not having a clear record check, and that might deter private landlords from renting, again, regardless of the situations.
How do you navigate that?
Good question. There's a lot of specific policy changes and solutions that I think need to be addressed at so many different levels. The fact that so many people are leaving jails with nowhere to go shows that this system, on top of some other systems, are just not functioning in the best interest of our communities. When people have nowhere to live, they are at an increased risk for all sorts of negative impacts and harms, as is our community. So I think the key to breaking the cyclical nature of criminality is safe and adequate housing, bar none, full stop. From Incarceration to Encampment highlights some specific policy changes and solutions that can make an incredible impact. All of the listeners, I urge them to read. It's a lengthy report, but I urge you to read it because there's not nearly enough time for me to touch on all of it, but there's some really incredible depth and insight into this specific issue. They did highlight some recommendations in the report that was informed by 44 key experts across the province, including those with lived or living experience. So some of the really important recommendations, where do we start? This is where we start. We look at, as I mentioned earlier, the creation of transitional homes for those who were incarcerated in provincial institutions who are transferring back into their communities, similar to what we do with those exiting federal institutions. These housing options are not just places where people live. They're culturally appropriate services. They have wraparound supports. They focus on addressing underlying social issues that have led to criminality and or recidivism rates. They have adequate and trauma-informed responses to crime and its causes, because that it doesn't end just because the sentence does. You need to build safe communities while addressing the root causes of crime to make sure that you're not stuck in that cycle, right? The homes like this can foster, a sense of community, which when people are connected to their communities, they're more apt to thrive in them. It supports housing readiness. They're not long-term solutions. The point is to get them in and transition them into independent living. They need to address substance use, because through the use of either, substance-free, sober living environments or harm reduction supports, we need to address that as an issue if somebody's coming out of institutions with that barrier. We know that those who use substances are at a higher risk of fatal drug poisoning as soon as they get out of institutions. So this means that there needs to be rapid and immediate evidence-based, trauma-informed programming available to them for immediate when they're immediately released. And then transitional homes can provide critical support services that they didn't necessarily get before or during their prison sentences, which is mental health, life skills, employment, which is a huge one. And then peer mentoring, huge. Peer mentorship is huge in kind of this world, because it really is the blueprint for this is where I was and this is where I am. And it gives people hope. And then every program that the John Howard Society facilitates really believes in supervision and risk management, which is a really crucial part in reintegration planning. So whatever the solution is, that needs to be embodied in that. And transitional homes would support mitigation of risks to the community while also supporting individuals in reentering communities. We talked a little bit earlier about reform to the parameters of social assistance. And then, of course, the amount of social assistance people receive. We know that the current rates are deeply inadequate for the current cost of living, specifically in our region, which is extremely high. And then there needs to be some reform for our government on the increasing use of criminal record checks. We are in the midst of an affordable housing crisis. We have very low stock of affordable housing in our region. And then many individuals are being further barriered to housing because they just won't pass a criminal record check. So not only is the stigma related to criminal record impacting people's lives, but it's also impacting their livelihoods, their ability to get jobs, and their ability to obtain housing. So in short, I don't know what the solution is, but that's some really good places to start.
Sounds like a lot of places we can start. And, at the core of it, when you started, is really speaking to how housing is key to breaking the cycle. Because from a place of housing, you have stability. You can start looking for your employment, start navigating different challenges. I think what we hear on this podcast a lot is that housing is a place where you can build from. And so some of the things that you identified just there are kind of preventing that in some ways. And so some really meaningful options for change there. I have a question, and I don't mean to blindside you because this wasn't in the script, but I was thinking about what you were saying, and I'm wondering, do you know off the cuff, have we seen, like, especially with the pandemic, where we saw levels of poverty, food insecurity, homelessness rise, like families, individuals who had never had those experiences were now facing that, and even after the pandemic, even more so. Did you see the same type of data coming through your agency with those who were incarcerated and like physically impacted by poverty and homelessness to essentially work their way into the justice system?
So interestingly enough, during the pandemic, we know that our provincial institutions are overcrowded. So during the pandemic, the province made quick work of releasing individuals who were safe to be released prior to the release dates to empty out more of the institutions to stop the spread, right? Which was really fantastic, for some people maybe who were waiting for their family members to come home, but not so much for individuals who thought they had another 3-6 months left on the inside and had absolutely no resources planned on the outside, right? Add the pandemic to that, where things were already so challenging, it just kind of further added to the cyclical nature of, I'm getting out of jail, I'm being released into a community where I have no supports, but then there's a pandemic. I can't even go to Tim Hortons to use the bathroom right now, even though I'm unhoused, because nobody's allowed inside these buildings anymore. A lot of people had their doors shut during COVID. A lot of social service agencies, because they had to, right? A lot of the people that were continuing to work and open their doors could really only do so much with the supports that we were given at the time. So the numbers during COVID really did inflate in terms of the needs that we were seeing, but I'm not sure, and I have no data to back this up, but I'm not sure that they've ever went back down, right? Because from the pandemic, we've now seen rising cost of living, rising, cost of housing, our interest rates flew right up. So, while maybe the average person managed to recover from that, people who were struggling post-pandemic struggled the greatest during the pandemic, and I think are still trying to catch up post-pandemic. And then, of course, now, while the government was really trying to support everybody during the pandemic by, investing in social agencies and supports, that no longer exists anymore. So we're left with the same problem and now less resources to offer people.
And so, for our listeners right now who obviously care a lot about housing, homelessness, and the people that we serve, and are impacted by the scale of this issue, what is one meaningful action, whether at an individual or community level, that could help drive change?
Yeah. So I think the most important thing that anybody who's listening can do to make a meaningful difference is to understand that we are all just one really bad decision away from homelessness or from legal system involvement. Nobody wants to be unhoused. Nobody wants to be stuck in a perpetual cycle of justice system involvement. People are not inherently bad. Criminality is not a character flaw necessarily. Sometimes it is just the result of people trying to survive in a deeply and profoundly broken system. If more people understood the stigma and shame that so many incarcerated and unhoused individuals feel and on a daily level, they may be more empathetic to the struggles instead of turning a blind eye. So I think instead of an action, it's kind of going within and recognizing, maybe what these people are going through. I think you can attest to this. We live in a really amazing region. Those who live here, those who police our communities, those who sit on council, who make the decisions, they want to see our communities thrive. So this is an issue that's really bigger than any one level of decision makers. And yet we still come together and we continue to have these conversations and try to find these solutions. And so with acts like this, I'm confident one day we'll get it right and we'll figure out the solution. If, agencies like yours and mine, and then the community as a whole continue to fight for tangible and meaningful change with the support of our community.
Thank you, Shannon, so much. This has
Yeah.
been a really informative conversation, super eye-opening as well. When I heard you say at a presentation recently that, from incarceration to encampment, I was like, wow, like that is that's a line that maybe not many people think of on the day to day. And so again, I say, like, for wherever you are in your belief on the scale of housing and homelessness, and the debate around anything, what we can all agree on, I think, is that housing is key to the solution.
Yeah.
Whether, as a nation we believe it's a human right, when we think of public safety and our communities and cost savings and economic sense, this seems to be making, just as much sense in for the people you serve and in your line of work as well, that housing is a cost saving. So that's something we can all agree on. And the reality that you shared today of so many individuals leaving incarceration without stable housing is something we can't ignore. So if there's one takeaway, is that this is preventable, and with the right policies and the right supports and the collective action and the will to act. So thank you, Shannon. Any special last words for our listeners, or where people can find the report maybe too?
So John Howard Society of Ontario website has all of the resources, and they are just a wealth of information when it comes to anything regarding the justice system, incarceration, homelessness, as it relates to incarceration, substance use, evaluation, data. They have some really incredible stuff on there. And then of course, all of the 18 local affiliates in Ontario are linked to that website as well. So John Howard Society of Ontario, really fantastic place to start. And then I think also listeners need to recognize that I don't have the numbers, but I just know from being in this field long enough that it's a lot less to build houses for people than it is to keep them locked up in institutions. So there's your cost savings right there.
For sure.
Thank you so
much, Shannon, to you, your team, the John Howard Society across, for all the work you do every day. It's so appreciated. Thank you so much for joining the show today.
Bye-bye.
So that was Shannon Speirs, Executive Director of the John Howard Society of York Region, whose leadership brings urgent attention to the connection between justice involvement and housing instability. Shannon's insights highlight how preventable cycles of homelessness often begin at the point of release, and how better policy, stronger reintegration supports, and access to stable housing can create very different outcomes. Thank you for listening to On the Way Home, a podcast brought to you by Blue Door. Stay with us for more conversations exploring pathways to home and belonging for all.